but that doesn't mean we can't all take a little trip to Canada today. So today, not only are we getting to check out this amazing distillery, but we have three of the leading minds in Canadian whiskey here with us today. So I'm really excited for them to show you around one of the most prolific and impressive distilleries in the whole wide world. As most of you know, Hiram Walker makes J.P. Wiser's, Pipe Creek, Lot 40, Gooderham, and Wort, right? Amazing whiskeys. And as you know, they're some of Canada's best whiskeys, but they're also some of the best whiskeys in the world. They win award after award after award. And if you've tasted it, you know why, right? So you're going to want to stick around because you're going to hear directly from Gina Fossitt, Dave Mitton, and Dr. Don, all of whom you see right here. They'll be joining us to tell us everything we need to know about the Hiram Walker Distillery and all of those amazing products that I just mentioned. But I have one little piece of news before we get into the tour. I want to tell you a little bit about this incredible program that Gina and the team cooked up for all of you. So I know you all love Canadian whiskey and you want to know more about it, right? Canadian whiskey is one of those categories that we're really excited about, but the education just isn't always out there, right? Well, good news. These three beautiful people are going to tell you all about Canadian whiskey, not just today, but in a Canadian whiskey certification program that's going to be launching in the winter. So you're going to want to stay tuned for all of the information about that. Best way to do that, of course, follow Camp Run 'em Up on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, make sure you're signed up for our newsletter, and subscribe on YouTube if you're into that too. All right, that's a really good way to get all of that info. Also, you can head over to camprunnemup.org/Canada, where we'll also have more information ready to go for you, okay? All right, so you've heard me talk enough about this. I want you to hear directly from the mastermind behind this program. I'm gonna bring in Gina Fossitt. For those of you who don't know Gina, she has accomplished basically everything a human can accomplish in the world of whiskey. So, WSET certified. Yes, you have. Don't pretend like you haven't. WSET certified, executive bourbon stewardship. She's been a master of whiskey. She did internships at George Dickel. She's made whiskey in Scotland. You name the kind of whiskey, Gina's probably made it. And if not, she knows all about it. So I'm really excited for her to be leading the way on this program and also on the tour today. So Gina, tell us a little bit more about what you have planned.
All right. So this online certification, we are super excited to bring this to life. We've been working on this for months and writing and testing it, and we are ready to go. So it's going to be a 5-week course that we will deep dive into Canadian whiskey as a category, going into history, regulations, production, maturation, blended whiskey, and rye whiskey as a category as well. There's workshops every week for those participating, and there will be quizzes every week, and there's a final test. So it's a pretty big program, but it's something new to learn and put on your resume. We're very proud of it, and we're excited to bring it to life with you.
I mean, I've gotten a chance to look through the materials, and I can tell you right now, this is not 101. This is master's level stuff. So I'm really, really, really stoked about it. Thank you so much, Gina. Well, I think it's time maybe to start visiting the distillery, right?
Let's do it.
Amazing. I guess I'm starting off. Hi, guys. I'm Dave Mitton, Global Brand Ambassador to Canadian Whiskies here at Hiram Walker Sons Distillery. And we have our brands, our iconic brands, JP Weiser's blends, and our unique expressions like Lot 40, Gooder Ham & Worts, and Pike Creek Whiskey. Now, generally I'm on the road about 40 weeks a year, and I'm traveling around the world, all the countries that our whiskeys are sold in, and I'm meeting bartenders and whiskey nuts, and basically everyone I come across, I'm trying to teach them the history of Canadian whiskey, certainly the process and production, our history in cocktails. Right now, we've been stuck at home over the last few months, so today we're so excited to take you through the entire distillery from grain to glass here at Hiram Walker. We are in the most southern point of Canada, which is a unique climate of aging Canadian whiskey. We are also one of the largest distilleries in North America. And that entails, when it comes to barrels, we have over 1,300 barrels that come in and go out of drain and fill every day in an 8-hour period. We have 16 warehouses housing our barrels, 6 pallets high and 600 rows deep. We currently have 1.6 million barrels of whiskey laying down in our warehouses, and we bottle close to 6 million cases of product annually. Now, a little bit of history on Canadian whiskey. We've been produced for over 150 years. We are sold in 170 countries around the globe, but yet Canadian whiskey kind of flies under the radar. It's not viewed as, it's viewed as a more misunderstood spirit category, to be quite honest. And it's not exotic like Japanese or Irish whiskey. It's not considered premium all the time like Scottish whiskey, not fun like bourbon whiskey. But we've been challenging those preconceptions over the last few decades as Canadian whiskey producers, showing that Canadian whiskey is a youthful spirit, lots of diversity, and it has the ability to be an incredibly innovative whiskey category, to be quite honest. Our master blender, Dr. Don Livermore, who you will meet later on today, oversees everything at Hiram Walker Distilleries. We can embrace the rules now and be very innovative when it comes to making Canadian whiskey. For instance, the rules to making Canadian whiskey, very simple. You must use cereal grain like international law. We use corn, rye, wheat, and barley here. You must be fermented in Canada, and we must be distilled in Canada. Now, when it comes to distilling, we can column distill once, we can double column distill, we can once column and then pot distill as well. Now, Gina Fossitt is going to get into this much later on. But also our aging laws. Very simple. Canadian whiskey must be aged in a wooden cask under 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years. Now, that leaves so many opportunities open. Like Ireland and Scotland, we buy up a lot of ex-bourbon casks from our neighbors to the south in the US, but we also use new American oak. We use new French oak. We use rum. We use different sherries, port, Madeira, different Scotch whiskeys. It goes on, as you can imagine. The world is our oyster. Now, for our finishing barrels, it's very simple. Whatever spirit was in that barrel beforehand, when it's been used, it stays in the wood. When we introduce the new spirit, whiskey, let's say, into a rum cask, that rum comes out and introduces itself into the whiskey, which Dawn is going to get into a lot more down the road. One little fact that I think most people don't realize about Canadian whiskey, and I call this our one bragging right, where Canadian whiskey and Canada came around a lot longer after Scotland and Ireland and the US. A lot of rules and regulations were put in place. But did you know that Canada was the first country to mandate an aging law for their whiskeys? And that's true. So in 1887, it was mandated to age our whiskey 1 year, and that was essentially to distinguish for quality, to be called a Canadian whiskey. Now, in the year 1890, that law changed to a minimum of 2 years. So you'd imagine back in the late 1800s, what were barrels used for? Transportation, essentially. I mean, we're looking right now, there's a forklift going up 6 pallets high in our warehouses. And back then, you didn't have forklifts. So barrels were used to transport whiskey. But imagine in this time and period, if I had a barrel of whiskey and we were sampling from it and the whiskey was empty, the barrel was empty, I'm going to bring it back to my home, to the hut or log cabin of the time I'm staying in, and I'll probably keep it for storage. Maybe we'll put furs or pickles or fish into that. And now you can imagine if there's been pickles or fish in there for a month and you take the barrel back to the distillery to be filled up again, that's going to be pretty nasty. So the idea to burn out those flavors from the wood came into play. And now that when you're taking this whiskey, this light styled whiskey, which Gina is going to get into later, and you introduce it to the new charred wood, what happens? All the beautiful dark colors. You're looking at Dr. Dawn right there. Beautiful amber, vanillas, toffee caramels come from the barrel. And it worked so well that it was almost 20 years later that Ireland and Scotland followed suit and mandated a law to age our whiskey. At that point in time, Canadian whiskey was revered and known as a very high quality whiskey around the globe. Now in 1974 was the last time the law changed, and to be called a Canadian whiskey, you must be aged a minimum of 3 years. And then the next step would be you can add caramel coloring, which is very true to most whiskeys around the globe. Must be bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV. And we can add a 9.09% of a 2-year aged spirit or a wine to our blends. Now that sounds a little confusing, I know, but the ability to be the innovation we can do with that as well is incredible. Dr. Dawn's going to get into that a lot later on after you hear from Gina. Now, right now, I figure we're going to try a couple of whiskeys as well. I'm going to taste on 2 of our lighter styled corn whiskeys. First up would be Pike Creek. This is a Canadian whiskey made in a traditional sense, or starts off in a traditional way. It is a soft double column distilled corn whiskey with a little touch of once column distilled rye, aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks for 10 years. And that brings on a lot of autumn florals, mature oak characteristics to it. Also, in our warehouses, where those 1.6 million barrels are laying down, they're non-temperature controlled, so temperatures fluctuate. Now, in the summer months, we get up to 35 degrees Celsius, which that's about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty warm. Today, it's pretty muggy and sweaty. But this winter in February, it gets down to minus 35, minus 40 Celsius, and that equals to negative 40 Fahrenheit as well. So it gets really cold. So the barrels extract and tighten up at great rates, as you can imagine. Now, when this 10-year-old corn whiskey is introduced into the rum cask afterwards, we age it for 200 days in the rum casks. Now that essentially is enough time for the diffusion takeover. You can almost see the color difference, how this is a beautiful, dark, rich amber, almost mahogany to it. Now, this is one of my favorite whiskeys for cocktails as well. Light, easy sipping, probably the sweetest whiskey we have. On the nose, I get lots of like brown sugar, Caribbean spice, almost a little bit of green apple, honey. Beautiful, easy to sip on, almost like Christmas cake to it. Lots of Caribbean spice there. Drink is perfect on its own, but it also works brilliantly in cocktails. In your summer months, you can do almost tiki-style drinks. We've noticed a lot of bartenders muddling up herbs and fresh citrus, crushed ice, stunner. But in the winter, we're also seeing a lot of people use it for dessert-style cocktails, coffee cocktails with that rum influence. It's beautiful. And second, last but not least, is the J.P. Weiser's 18-year-old. This is probably our lightest styled whiskey, and Canadian whiskey isn't always about rye that you're going to learn from Gina and Don. This is 100% soft corn whiskey. Stunning to sip on. Now, Dr. Don will always say, this is the taste of angel share. So with those temperature fluctuations I was talking about, and at the 1.6 million barrels, we have a 3% angel share annually. Now, what that equivalates to is we lose 48,000 barrels of whiskey every year. That's a lot of whiskey that just disappears. Now, this is also very simple. 100% corn whiskey, double column distilled, aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks. After the 10-year mark of aging, you have the chemical reaction of ethyl acetate, which Don will get into with his flavor wheel later on today. But essentially, this imparts the flavor of green apple. And this happens with all whiskeys. If it's a Scotch whiskey, it could be covered up by the peated grain, smokiness. If it was a bourbon whiskey, it could be covered up by the way it's distilled and its heavy grain. With this being a light styled corn whiskey, it comes off perfectly. Like, and everyone's going to taste and smell something different, but I get the green apple right away off of this. Beautiful, easy sipping. Lots of mature oak, autumn florals, baked apples, rich caramel. This is this easy sipper on its own. Cube of ice if you like at the end of a day. But yeah, two beautiful examples of corn-styled whiskeys. Thanks for listening to me, guys. And I think we're going to tune over to Gina and learn about fermentation and distillation next.
Thanks, Dave. And I missed the opportunity to properly introduce you, but and of course, Dave is too humble to do this himself, but he is our global ambassador, and he's been with the company for 7 years, educating on Canadian whiskey. I've learned so much from him. Before you were a global ambassador, you were owning and operating bars, mostly in Toronto, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
For quite a while.
So super experienced, and been a pleasure to work with. I've learned so much. But anyways, proper introduction for you, Dave. Thank you. I'm going to take everybody through, the production process for the most part, more of the operations side. And then Dr. Don's going to take us kind of beyond that and how everything comes together. So first, let's talk about the grains. As Dave mentioned, whiskey is made from cereal grains. So at Hiram Walker, we produce whiskey from corn, wheat, rye, barley. We've got malted rye, malted barley whiskeys as well. Corn's going to impart that sweet, creamy flavor note. Wheat with toasty, bready notes. You're going to get a nutty character from barley, and of course, that iconic spice note from rye. There's no minimum or maximum amount of any type of grain required to be labeled a Canadian whiskey. So the most common misperception, that we come across is with rye. In the US, Americans have a very specific idea in mind when something is labeled rye. But American rye is very different, their rules and regulations, from Canadian rye. Just like Scotch, the rules and regulations are very different than Irish, but they're both very well known for making whiskey from barley. So there was a heavy English influence on the Canadian whiskey category. The English migrated in masses in the early to mid 1800s to Canada. And with them, they brought with their expertise in making wheat products. So the first commercial distillers in Canada were English. There's Thomas Molson up on the screen. He was our first commercial distiller. And the first commercially distilled grain was wheat. Wheat being that lighter, softer, sweeter grain. Wheat bread, wheat whiskey, that's what Canadians were used to drinking. So until the Germans brought rye to Canada, much like they did in the US, and also on the West Coast, migrating up from the California gold rush. Now, at the same time, we've got a train system being built across Canada, connecting people, connecting ideas, innovation happening in a lot of different industries, whiskey included. And soon the English began adding just a little bit of rye to their wheat whiskeys, like 5 to 10%, no more than 20%. So just a little bit, but drastically changing the flavor profile from what people were used to drinking, adding that spicy note. So if you were lucky enough to go to a bar or a saloon and see 2 barrels of whiskey on that back bar, you either ordered a whiskey, which was all wheat, or you ordered a rye, which was primarily wheat with just a little bit of rye in it. And as an ode to this history today, Canada still does not have a minimum requirement of rye required to be labeled a Canadian rye whiskey. Now, when we talk about a traditional style, eventually those Northerners got their hands on corn from the US and began growing it themselves. And today, the most distilled grain in Canada is corn. Again, that lighter, softer, sweeter style. And that's really what a traditional style, or what most people think of a Canadian whiskey, is today. Primarily corn with maybe a little bit of rye in there. So let's talk about production. We get truckloads of grain every day at Hiram Walker from the local farmers. One family, generationally, has provided grain to Hiram Walker to the distillery since it opened in 1858. We take in about 100,000 metric ton of corn a year and 10,000 metric ton of rye a year. And you can see here, a truck pulls up, it's time for a quality check. So you can see that probe going down into the grain. And they're going to take samples of the grain from different parts of the truck all the way to the bottom to ensure that no faulty grain has been layered anywhere in there. And there's the truck pulling up. And a lot of this video footage, we're really just trying to show you scope of the distillery. And there's Alice. So once the sample's taken, it comes into Alice, and she's going to do a lot of quality tests right off the bat. She is our gatekeeper. She has the right to reject any truck based on smell alone. Now, she does a lot of different tests, but when she's smelling the grain, she's specifically looking for a compound called geosmin, which gives a musty smell, and we cannot distill that out. It's going to end up in the whiskey years down the road. So we take a lot of pride in the quality of our grains. One little defect here could result in a lot of bad whiskey 5, 10, 20 years down the road. So her job really is one of the most important ones you can see. And you'll see her here doing a lot of different tests. She does have to move it along though, because she could be going through 10 trucks in a day. So once the truck passes inspection, the grain's going to go to one of those 19 silos you see behind that truck in the background there, waiting to be milled into a grist. And he's offloading that grain. It's going to go into those grates down below and then, through pipes into those silos. But you can again see the scope here of how much grain is being taken in per each truck. Crazy. Also, the view of Detroit from the top of those silos, it's spectacular. You got to climb up there if you ever get to the distillery. We try to take people up when we can. And there's that truck offloading the grain some more, just to give you a little bit different perspective on how that looks. Yeah. So one of our biggest takeaways on Canadian whiskey production is that the grains are all produced separately. Now, before we get to that, we are using a hammer mill, like most North American distilleries do, to make our grist into like a coarse flour-like consistency. You can see right there in that person's hands. So the grains are all produced separately. They're going to go through fermentation, distillation, maturation at 100% grain builds. Most Canadian whiskey distilleries, I should say, do not make mash bills. Now, that's not everybody. Some people do, but most of your bigger distillers are going to produce whiskey this way at 100% grain builds, whereas most American distilleries will make a mash bill or blend those grains at the beginning of production. It's not regulated for Canadian whiskey or for American whiskey, that either one of them do it either way. It's just kind of the way it's primarily done. So again, with American whiskey, we're kind of blending those grains primarily at the beginning during the cooking process, how much corn, how much wheat, how much rye, etc., and then taking that mash bill through the entire production. Whereas in Canada, we're going to take 100% corn, ferment it, distill it, age it. We've got corn, rye, wheat, etc. And there's lots of possibilities in fermentation and different distillations, etc. And different types of wood to produce lots of different styles of corn, rye, wheat, barley, whiskeys. And this is why Canadian whiskey is most known or most well known for blended whiskey, because we are blending the whiskeys after production. Now, it wasn't always this way, but I'm going to let Dr. Don dive into that a little bit later and tell you how that came about. So for the cooking process, once it's decided which grain they're producing, it's time to mix it with the other ingredients. So we've got our grist. We're going to mix that with water from the Great Lakes watershed. We've got the Detroit River right outside, enzymes, nitrogen, and sour mash or backstillage, which is widely used in North America. And this is really the leftover sludge at the bottom of the still after distillation. It's kind of like an oatmeal consistency. We're going to put a bit of that into the next batch to bring down the pH levels, balance that out, and keep batch to batch consistency. So the rest of the backstillage then is processed into dried or wet grains and gets sold back to the local farmers for animal feed. So this is really full circle. We're doing a lot more wet grains these days to conserve energy and really limit our carbon footprint at Hiram Walker. But we do process these into both dried and wet grains. And historically speaking, you know, J.P. Weiser is one of our brands. He actually purchased his distillery in the 1800s for the sole purpose of the backstillage. He was a breeder, a cattle breeder, and he knew that high quality grains really meant that he could breed bigger cattle. And he was very successful at that. And then he became a very successful whiskey producer as well. But it's really full circle for us, you know, getting it back to the animals and minimizing waste. So after cooking, we do have a mash. We're going to heat that up, let the starch from the grains heat up and pop open. These are really large starch strains, and they're too large for the yeast, which we're going to add later, to digest. So this is where the enzymes can start to go into action once they're popped open. The enzymes are going to break these large starch strains down into smaller starch strains and sugar molecules, really food for the yeast to start its job in the process. The mash is going to be cooled, and it's going to go into the fermentation tanks where we add the yeast. So at Hiram Walker, now this video footage, we're really trying to give you an inside look here. It is hard to get this all in one shot, but we have 39 fermentation tanks that stand 4 stories high. So you're going to see a lot of different angles here because it's just impossible to capture this all in one shot, but we do use them all. This is where we add the yeast that we talked about. It's going to feed on those smaller starch strains and those sugar molecules. And as it begins to multiply and feed, it's going to start to bubble. So just taking a look here. Now, if you were actually at the distillery taking a tour, you would not get to go underneath the fermentation tanks that you see right there. But so here he comes. He's going to put in the yeast. It is a powdered yeast that he's adding there. And then it's going to start to do its job of eating the starch and producing alcohol, carbon dioxide, and a few other things that we're going to talk about in a minute here. So there goes the yeast into the fermentation tank. And you can see in there, it's already starting to bubble a little bit, right? And there's the mash being poured. So there's Amy. She's our distiller along with Dave. She's going to pull a sample out of that fermentation tank to show you. But it is starting to bubble. And that's where it's producing that carbon dioxide as well as alcohol. But it's also producing, the yeast is also producing some flavor compounds that are going to be really important in our final whiskey. So it's going to produce green grassy notes, floral notes, fruity notes, sulfur notes, soapy notes. And at the end of fermentation, you've got a beer, a distiller's beer. It's going to be 8 to 9% ABV for our flavoring grains, so rye, wheat, and barley. And we actually get up to about 15% ABV, sometimes a little higher for our corn, which is significantly higher than a lot of distilleries. That's just how we feed the nitrogen into the fermentation process, really making that a process to get as much alcohol out and yield as we can there. So different distillation methods, which is going to come next of that beer, that's going to determine which of those flavor compounds that were produced by the yeast end up in our final product. So let's take that beer to the stills, make some whiskey. Not quite, because it's not 3 years old, like Dave said, so we're closer. Make a spirit. So there's many types of stills and methods of distilling, of course. This part of the process really is going to help us increase our ABV and help determine which flavor notes from the grain and the yeast that are going to remain in our whiskey and we're going to end up tasting. At Hiram Walker, we have 3 different distillation styles that really help shape our whiskey. You know, Dr. Don always says, don't ask him how much rye or whatever, pick a grain, rye, for example, is in the whiskey, but also ask him how it was distilled, because that's really going to determine how much of that grain, let's use rye as an example, how much of those spicy notes or the grain flavor notes are going to be in our end product. You'll see why here in a minute. So one style we use is single column distillation, and there is our still house. This is one pass through a column still. Some would call it a beer still. It stands 5 stories high and it's 100% copper. Now it is insulated on the outside because it gets extraordinarily hot. The beer is going to go in at the top or toward the top, and steam's going to flow up through the bottom. And in each one of those doors that you just saw, there's a copper plate with holes in it. She's going to open this one up for us, Amy, there. And that's for the beer to flow down through and the steam to come up through. And so you're really seeing a mini distillation at each plate in the still. Finally, the vapor is going to come out the top there, and we're going to end up with a full-bodied spirit that retains most of the grain character, most of the yeast character. We're going to retain the fruity notes, floral notes, green grassy notes, the soapy notes, but the sulfur is actually going to be stripped away by the copper. So that's why copper plays such an important role in distillation. It's really going to help strip away that sulfur that yeast produced. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to taste sulfur in my whiskey. At this point, we're going to be at about 70% ABV on this spirit. So we also do a double column distillation at Hiram Walker. This is a first pass through that column still we just talked about. Same process. And then we're going to do a second pass through another column still. Someone called this a rectifying still. So the more you distill through column stills, the more of that grain and yeast character that you're going to strip out, and the lighter of a spirit that you're going to get at the end of the day. And there's Don taking some of that out of the still now. We strip out most of the grain and most of the yeast character here, leaving us with that light style. Could be used as a base whiskey in some of our blends, kind of like the glue holding those big flavoring whiskeys together. Or, could be used on its own, like Dave showed with J.P. Weiser's 18, and really highlighting the ethyl acetate development in the warehouses. So there's lots of different ways to use this lighter spirit and really show off different components depending on the blend. This one's going to come up to about 94.5% ABV. Now, the third distillation style we do at Hiram Walker is pot distillation. And first, we're going to take it through that single column still, just like we did for double column distillation as well. But then we're going to take a batch to the pot still. And right there is the lot 40 still. It's 100% copper, insulated on the outside again. We're doing about 8,000 liter batches in this and a super slow distillation, 12 hours. That's a very slow distillation process. And the reason for that is because the slower that you evaporate those vapors off the liquid and the longer you can hold those temperatures, then the more accurate cut points Amy, our distiller, can make on the liquid. And that final product, she can really concentrate up specific flavors that she wants to keep in there. So here we're going to end up with a full-bodied, full-flavored whiskey coming up to about 80% ABV. And again, there's our still house with Dawn outside. Okay, we've got two really great whiskeys to kind of show you some of what I just talked about. First up is lot 40 here. This is one of the distillates at Hiram Walker. So this is 100% rye, going through the entire process at 100% rye. It is first column distilled and then pot distilled in that process that I just went through with you. And it's aged in brand new American oak. So here, Amy is cutting out the green grassy notes and the soapy notes, and she's really concentrating up the fruity, floral, and spice notes of the rye. And then it's being aged in those brand new American oak casks, really balancing out, giving it some vanilla caramel to balance out that big, bold rye. We use this, we bottle it up as lot 40, but we also use this in blends. A really good example, and Dawn's going to talk about this a little later, is back here at Hiram Walker, lot 40, as well as other whiskeys, but lot 40 is a big component of Hiram Walker. This is my favorite Manhattan rye, and we like to say this is rye in its purest form. It's 100% rye, brand new oak. We're pot distilling, really concentrating up those flavors. One of my favorites, especially for Manhattan. Next up is JP Wiser's Triple Barrel Rye here. Now, this is a blend. It is not a traditional style of Canadian rye that we talked about, that lighter, mostly corn with a little bit of rye. This was actually made with the American palate in mind. So it is 60% single column distilled rye, much like our big house American rye distilleries produce rye whiskey. Not all of them, of course, but much like a lot of them produce rye whiskey in a single column still. That is how this rye whiskey is produced. And then it is aged in ex-bourbon casks, bringing some dried fruit notes to it. Then we also have a double column distilled corn, so that lighter, softer corn whiskey, aged in used Canadian cask, and just a little bit of pot distilled wheat, aged in brand new American oak, bringing in those bready notes and those caramel vanilla notes to really layer. This is a layered rye. It works well in a lot of great cocktails. I love it in a whiskey sour myself. Okay, so now I am going to pass this off to Dr. Don with an intro, a proper intro. He is our master blender. He does have a PhD in brewing and distilling from Heriot-Watt University. He has won Master Blender of the Year the last 2 years. He and his team have won Distillery of the Year 4 consecutive years in a row. He's also celebrating his 25th anniversary at the distiller. So proud to work, with him and be able to educate with the whiskeys that he and his team produces. But he's going to tell us how he brings all these aspects together. Dr. Don, it's all yours.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Dave. Wonderful explanation of Canadian whiskey, and I'm so happy and delighted that the group and the audience got to see the inside of the Hiram Walker Distillery. I'm certainly a very proud member of the team here, as with 350 of our other employees that do work here, and I believe we got some of the best distillers, blenders, engineers in the business, and I think it really shows in our whiskey. I want to talk to you today a little bit about blending whiskey, and I got to say, blending is beautiful. You can bring in lots of different flavors, as Gina talked about in making whiskey. In behind me here is my Blending 101, where I get groups coming here. We can select between 140 different whiskeys that are in maturations and casks right now, and you can walk away making your own blended whiskey. How cool is that? But I want to always go back into why Canadian whiskey has turned out to be blended. There are so many different styles of Canadian whiskeys today with lots of different flavors, and one of them was Gooderham and Worts that Gina talked about with that complexity in that 4-grain blend. But the original distillers in Canada weren't really blenders. They came to Canada in the 1700s, 1800s from Ireland, from Scotland, from England, and they were like Weissers and Henry Corby and Gooderham and Worts, but they came to Canada with opportunity, and they were grain millers, and they ran mercantile shops, and they traded in livestock, as Gina alluded to, that's why J.P. Weiser started a distillery. Whiskey was a secondary business to them. Early Canadian distillers would have never separated the grains like we do today. We do that for the purpose of innovation, because it's easier to innovate with separated mash bills much later and down the road. But at the start, they would have had about 70 to 80% corn in their mash bills. They would have about 12 to 17% rye. They would have had some barley malt, obviously, to convert those into sugars. And obviously, we've actually seen they actually would put oats in it to it. My thought and theories behind oats in their mash bill at that time was that's what was the leftovers after they fed their horses. Anyhow, but they really did not have proper knowledge and fermentation techniques. Their hygienic practices would have been very poor. They would have pitched yeast directly around the phases of the moon. And if you really think about it, you look at when microbiology was discovered, and that was Louis Pasteur in 1858. Those were the times our distilleries actually started in that area, in our time period. And they would have been using the real small copper stills, making moonshine style of whiskey. Quite honestly, whiskey would have been unaged, and it was probably not very palatable. But there was a number of key events in history and key technological advances that made Canadian whiskey, which led to our blending today. And the most important event, most people think it's Prohibition that helped the Canadian whiskey category along. It truly wasn't. It was the American Civil War in 1861. Up to that point, Canadian whiskey was not largely known to the world, but if you think about the Civil War, it was America North fighting the America South. They would have shut down the distilleries. The men would have went off to war. They would have needed the grain for food. They would have needed the copper from their distillery for ammunition. That left a void, and that was the largest growth period for Canadian whiskey. All of a sudden, to J.P. Weiser's and Gooderham and Worts and Hiram Walker, they started making money based on their whisk scale, and they started to invest back into the business. And now we started seeing their quality improve. They improved their distillation techniques. They were starting to make that lighter, smoother whiskey that Gina just previously talked about. Our government took notice. They realized the potential revenue source that these distillers officers offered, and the excise officers, they realized the potential, the amount of money the Canadian government could make. They put excise officers into our distilleries. We had over 60 excise officers working at our warehouse at one point, and they forced the distillers now to become licensed, and they had to record the amount of grain they purchased. They had to record the amount of alcohol they produced. They had to document everything that was going on. To put it this way, around the Civil War period, it was about 6 cents a gallon for whiskey. By the time you hit the year 1900, they were paying over $2, 100 times increase in taxation. What can I say? Canada was built on whiskey. The 1870s, there was a global depression going on in the world, and almost lasted for 20 years, and that caused a number of things to happen in that time period. That caused metal prices to decline. They caused commodities to go really south as well. But what had happened was because of the metal prices went down, railways were starting to be built in and across North America, including southern Ontario and certainly across the northern part of America. And that allowed the distilleries that were on these railway spurs to now be able to compete and reach the markets even more so. That caused competition across our part of North America. And we now started to see other spirits coming into Canada and into the US, and that led into duties and taxation. And kind of see what's going on today. Canada had to protect their income. And at that point, what we needed to do and what we did as Canadians is they had in 1883 what they called was the Inland Revenue Act, where as Canadian whiskey producers, we could make all of our spirits all the way up to putting it into a bottle duty-free. We didn't have to pay the tax until it was in the bottle, and that's what we call in bond. Canadian whiskey spirits have been and continue today to be made under bond, and we still have excise officers coming into our site looking at our books. But that also caused a couple of things to happen, and I have in front of me here today. The Inland Revenue Act started now then keeping track of it. And you could see this bottle of Weiser's whiskey here, built in 1899 here, and you could see where they had the strip stamps going across the top of the bottle. This was that being in bond and holding that in the glass bottles at that point. Glass bottles started to show up in the 1800s as well, because up to that point they would have only been buying and selling and trading whiskeys in 10-gallon kegs. So as soon as that happens, then you get into branding. You start seeing brands appear into the Canadian whiskey. It used to be just Hiram Walker whiskey or J.P. Weiser's whiskey. This is the first brand of Weiser's himself. This is J.P. Weiser's Red Letter. So this was an ode to J.P. Weiser we did a number of years ago because that was the first brand. This 1883 Revenue Act forced branding and under the supervision of the Canadian government. As Dave alluded to, in 1890, the Canadian government really wanted to premiumize Canadian whiskey. And what they did at that point was they mandated an aging whiskey law. They wanted to increase the value and the image of Canadian whiskey, and it worked. These companies started to advertise. They started to showcase their brands. By the year 1900, Canadian whiskey sold more whiskey than any other whiskey category in the world. In fact, the Gooderham and Worts distillery downtown Toronto was the largest distillery in the world by the year 1900. They were making 2 million gallons of whiskey a year. The Canadian government forced the producers to start taking meticulous records of their production, just for that purpose. They were under strict supervision. All the ingredients had to be isolated. All the equipment had to be identified, including the barrels, the rack warehouses. Distillation became much more efficient. Because of all this writing down of the information, this naturally forced the producers to start creating recipes and becoming blenders. And here's a recipe here of some of the old original handwritten notes. And in fact, here I have the book. I thought I'd bring it out today. This is the book you actually see on screen here of the first recipes written in the 1800s. Yeah, it'll fall apart on me. It's such a fragile condition. But it was a very interesting way. There was a little bit more of a liberal type time when they were making whiskey back in the 1800s. They would make their whiskey. And then what they would do was they had these non-blending components into it. They were putting in tea and rum and American whiskeys. You can even see on the recipe I have there, they were adding in sugar and syrup, which you can't do today, or tea, you can't add that in today. And the last thing you could see on that blending recipe there, they were adding caramel coloring. I know it's a big deal about caramel coloring today, and the audience is, oh, do you add coloring, do you not? It's always been done. It's always been done, and they did it just, again, for consistency. But the thing is, with these non-whiskey blending components, they would never go above 10% in a blend. They would never do that. Post-Prohibition, the Canadian whiskey category became much more defined and the liberal blending practices were stopped. They wanted to certainly make whiskey a defined category in Canada, and Dave alluded to it, that we got to be made of grain, fermented, aged, and distilled in Canada, aged in a wooden barrel of less than 700 liters for a minimum of 3 years. But they still wanted to maintain that identity of these non-whiskey blending components. So here beside me, I put on the camera here, is a graduated cylinder. When I'm making whiskeys on the benchtop here, I would take any one of these 140 different things and I put it into a blend. Typically, most blends have 5 or 6 different ingredients, not 140. That'd be irrational in terms of it. But how they would design it is they would take the Canadian whiskey, they'd bring it up to 100. They still wanted to maintain that 10%, so that's now adding another 10% on top. That's 110. 10 divided by 110 is 9.09%. So we have in our rules today that we are allowed to blend in 9.09% wine or 2-year-old other spirit. Just to add another layer of complexity, just to add another type of flavor, what we can do into the business. I must be clear on 2 points. The 9.09, we don't have to use it. Some blends I do. For Weiser's 15-year, I'll blend in an apparel wine into that to give it a little bit of a dried fruit note to it. Other whiskeys we don't. The 9.09 tends to be the more expensive ingredients. I can honestly say our supply management group is, you want to put what into whiskey? In fact, there's a brand we made in Canada where we blended in a 52-year-old Scotch. How cool is that? That can bring in those types of things. The other thing I must say as well, and be clear about it, and it's a misnomer in our industry, is Canadian whiskey cannot add neutral grain spirit or vodka or gin, something unaged. Okay, it has to be something that is aged that's going into that. So as a master blender, I mean, I've got lots of different things I can certainly play with, and I hope you can come and blend with me, because we can make those light style whiskeys like the J.P. Weiser's Deluxe, and certainly all the way up to Pike Creek. Now, one of the things I'm going to do, I'm going to move here for just a second, is how do I come and look at blending whiskey? So in 2016, I was asked to make a flavor wheel. I'm sure the audience here knows what flavor wheels are. I kind of chuckled at it, and I got asked by the LCBO, which is the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, and I said, do people really actually use those? And I said, well, yeah, they do. So I put pen to paper, and this is the whiskey wheel that I've come up and developed here for the Canadian whiskey industry. I did this from the mindset of a blender. This is more different than most Canadian whiskey wheels. Where I took that flavor, as Gina mentioned earlier, can only come from 3 places, and it starts at the center of this wheel. It either comes from the grain, the yeast, or the wood. That's my mindset as a blender. So when I'm making those, that's where I can pull in lots of those flavors. The second ring of the wheel are the things that I can manipulate as a blender. So going back to the grain, I can add malt or corn or rye or barley and wheat. I like to ferment and distill them separately because I can change them post-aging. It makes it easier. We also have the spoilage. We talked about geosmin earlier. That can happen in whiskey, so it is on this wheel. Around the yeast, that's the fermentation. We can manipulate yeast to make green grass, fruity, floral, soapy, sulfur, sour notes. If you ever get a sour note in your whiskey or a dill note, that's a sign of infection. Certainly it can happen in the fermentations. Likewise with the wood, I can burn the cask a certain way and I can get vanilla or toffee notes. It depends how much temperature and how depth of char we put onto those barrels. We can finish it, as Dave talked about with the Pike Creek as well, and we can age it, giving that green apple note. The third ring of the wheel are what you guys care about. Those are the descriptors. And the outside ring of the wheel, which is the really cool part, my fascination, those are the molecular compounds that cause that flavor. So, for example, if you have a green apple note in your whiskey, that's ethyl acetate. It comes in because of aging. Likewise, if you have a banana note in your whiskey, that is the fruity note that is made by yeast. Likewise, if you have a spicy note, it's 4-ethyl glycol, and it comes from the grain rye. I always like to say, it's not how much rye is in your whiskey. Ask me how much 4-ethyl glycol is in your whiskey. So, with that, that is the flavor wheel. And I will say to the audience, and that you can just Google my name, Dr. Don Livermore, and a flavor wheel that will pop up, and it's certainly use it at your discretion. This is my mindset as a blender. I can dial things up, I can dial things down. I'm making whiskey for you, and I certainly would want you to tell me what type of flavors. Do you want a bigger, bolder whiskey? I know what I can bring up more rye, or if I want a softer, I can bring into more wheat. I can bring in pot stills, double column distill. That's why blending is beautiful. I honestly can say Canadian whiskey is the most innovative, creative, an adaptable style of whiskey there is. And I wouldn't want to work anywhere else as a blender in the world than for Canadian whiskey. And I'd like to thank and maybe open up to the floor to some questions around how Canadian whiskey is made, because you can certainly tell I'm very excited about it.
Absolutely.
And I hopefully I can get you guys excited about it as well.
Well, we definitely have some questions for you, Dr. Don. So, and of course, please, Gina, Dave, get in there too. All right. So the first question is it more common in Canada to age barrels upright, or is this specific to Hiram Walker?
For the probably larger producers, I do see palletized whiskey. It's just the efficiency of it, the storage, you can pack more in. There are people that do roll them and everything, but the thing is with that, it's just a safety concern. That's largely why we've moved to palletized warehouses, and we moved to them in the early 90s here in Hiram Walker. And I can't tell the difference whether they're on the side or on the pallet, but definitely, if you can get into our warehouse, which every one of you can come go there, it's its own organism. It really is, because the barrels are so tightly packed in there, it actually takes a bit for them to change temperature throughout the year. It's a good insulator effect, and this time of year, our whiskey in our barrels will probably be about 82, 84 Fahrenheit. Likewise, in the winter, we don't climate control our warehouses. They'll fall down to about 20 Fahrenheit. They'll fall below the freezing point of water. But it takes a bit to change temperature, actually. And when our employees go inside of our warehouse, they actually have to wear an oxygen monitor. That's how much ethanol vapor is in the air. And so as we get, all of a sudden, the Detroit area gets hot and humid in the springtime. We got ice cold whiskey in the warehouse, got warm air going in against these barrels with these metal hoops, and we get condensation forming on the hoops on our barrels. And I get a lot of whiskey producers come in and say, Don, I've never seen the hoops on barrels so rusted before. And it's because of our temperature change, and the breathing really is important. That's where I say there's that terroir to whiskey. And Dave mentioned that we do lose 3% a year to evaporation, and then we really drives home that green apple, that ethyl acetate note, certainly into our highly aged whiskeys like the Weiser's 18-year.
And to add to that, as Don said, a lot of the larger producers are upright and palletized, but I will say there's roughly about 300 micro distilleries across Canada right now, and I've been fortunate enough to visit quite a few in Ontario and BC, and a lot of them do have them laying down on their sides, a smaller.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. All right. The next question is, do you use a roller mill for the malted barley, or does it run through the hammer mill?
I could take that question if you want. Yeah, hammer mill. It goes through a hammer mill. We don't use a roller mill to that. If I had an opportunity to talk a little bit about cooking in whiskey, if you look at the shell of grain, it's fiber, and fiber is made up of a couple of molecules. It's cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Okay. When we cook, those are big molecules. If I had an opportunity to show them, but they're very, very big. When we're cooking and heating and distilling, it breaks it apart. Okay, and it breaks it apart into the really spicy molecules. So if you look on my whiskey wheel that I made under the rye section, it's got 4-ethylguaiacol, guaiacol, creosol, a number of those things. That comes in from the lignin part of the husk of the grain. Okay, so when we use a hammer mill, we have the opportunity to keep those flavor molecules. If I use a roller mill, it pinches them off, it goes through a lauter tun, and that opportunity is lost. So there's definitely an argument. Do you want hammer mills and you want that flavor component going into your whiskey, or do you actually want it removed? I don't know. I mean, There's no right or wrong answer, but it certainly plays to the final flavor of the whiskey, whether you use a hammer mill or a roller mill.
So cool. That was an awesome answer, Dr. Don. The next question is directed to you, Dr. Don. Which is your favorite unaged distillate? Do you like the corn, the wheat, the rye, the barley? What's your favorite?
I could pick up the bottle here. Sorry, I'm going off camera. I like a couple of them, actually. This one, this is called wheat, and we call it Star. So I do like that wheat one, because from that red winter wheat, it gives you that nice bready. I sometimes say it the Tim Hortons character to whiskey, if anybody knows what Tim Hortons is. Some people are nodding. Tim Hortons are very iconic in Canada.
That's our Dunkin' Donuts.
Right.
Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks. And the other one actually, and it's just from the previous answer I talked about, it's called pot barley. That's the one that we actually put into a pot still. But what pot barley is, it's barley that actually has the husk removed. And then we actually process it through our hammer mill. And what I've found through the number of years, I actually used barley with the husk on it, and sometimes I use barley as the pot barley with it removed. I find there could be an astringent bite to the whiskeys that sometimes that comes in from the barley. I can actually tell when I taste bourbons how much barley, there's an interesting bite that comes in from the husk and the malt as well. So it's an opportunity to play with different grains, and that's what I love about Canadian whiskey is when you keep everything separate, you can then control the fact afterwards.
Absolutely. Someone asked the group if we could very quickly go over Canadian whiskey regulations one more time. I think somebody's trying to get their notes together.
Okay.
Dave, you want to take that one since that was your section?
Yeah, I mean, as Dawn and Gina went into, it's very simple. You know, the first thing I've heard over the last 7 years is people, oh, Canadian whiskey has no rules and regulations. I'm like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You know, we have a category of Canadian whiskey. It's called Canadian rye whiskey, Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey. America, I think you've got, is it 36 categories of whiskey, Gina?
It's very difficult to actually count them the way that they are listed with the TTB, but I've gotten a group of colleagues together and we've decided there's over 36 federally regulated. That doesn't even include like state regulated categories.
One thing Gina and Dawn and I will talk about a lot is like we have so many different expressions of whiskey, but they all fall under one category. For instance, anyone that's interested in taking our ABCs of Canadian whiskey course, you will learn this along the way of the 5 weeks. But to be called a Canadian whiskey, it's simple. You must use cereal grain, which is international law, and we buy 100,000 metric tons of corn every year, 10,000 metric tons of rye, and the same goes for the wheat and barley, so the 4 grains. We must ferment our grains here in Canada, and it's not a rule, but we do keep everything separate from beginning to end. You must be distilled in Canada. So if you find a Canadian whiskey, you know that it has been fermented and distilled. We can distill in any way we want, as Gina went through. Very common practice here at Hiram Walker, at least, is a single column distillation, double column distillation, and single column distillation along with pot distillation are the 3 common distillates you'll find, or styles here. You must be aged in Canada. So unlike different American whiskey categories, if you were drinking a Canadian whiskey, you know that it was aged in Canada for a minimum of 3 years. It can't be any younger or cannot be called a Canadian whiskey. Now, here at Hiram Walker, I think our average youngest blend we put out is probably about 5 years, but we have ranges all the way up to a 35-year-old whiskey. So 3 years and anything goes afterwards. We could use any type of barrel under 700 liters. Very common practice is ex-bourbon casks, the same as Ireland and Scotland. We do use a lot of new American oak, new French oak. You name the type of sherries, Madeira, port, wine. It's endless. Don can experiment. I think he's got some Black Sea casks right now, which I don't know if I'm supposed to say that out loud, but he's got a lot of fun things coming down the line. Must be bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV. And we go all the way up as high as our cask strengths. Don might correct me. I think the highest cask strength we've put out so far is 64.5 ABV with the Lot 40. And we may use caramel coloring, as a lot of whiskey categories around the world do, to keep consistency. And our unique regulation is that 9.09 rule, where you may add a 2-year aged spirit or a wine to it. And this is something, you know what? I'm just going to go into this for a minute. This is something over the last 7 years. And Gina kind of made it clear to me, I couldn't understand. Everywhere I went, people would say, oh, Canadian whiskey, you can add maple syrup to it. You can put beaver pelts. People thought you could add whatever you want. And I thought, where is this coming from? And Gina pointed out to me one day, she was teaching me, as you know, as Gina's a whiskey expert, she was showing me some American whiskey things. And I didn't realize that American blended whiskey, you can add up to, I think it's 80% neutral grain spirit or vodka, Gina.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, I'm like, is this where people turn their nose down at blended Scotch or blended Canadian whiskey? But in those two countries, you cannot add a neutral grain spirit or vodka to it. But in America, if it's blended, you can. So I often wonder if those two things connect somehow.
The lines have gotten blurred for some people.
Yeah, it's a very liberal. I mean, I think they've intentionally, I've sat in with our Canadian excise government on things like that, and they've talked about making more categories, but the distillers here in Canada tend to like the rule we have where it's wide open to the interpretation of the blender. They really want the creativity to come to you, so they've kept, I mean, certain specific things, but at the same time, they wanted you to create your own style. And maybe that's part of the confusion with Canadian whiskey, because you can get from a really light style all the way to a very big, bold whiskey like Lot 40. One of the other things, if you really get into a master class of mine, the whiskey wheel, which is very, very powerful, what I can do with it is I can make bar graphs. So they're called polar histograms, and I can paint a picture to each and every whiskey that I make. Instead of those spider diagrams, I think people usually make, those things they look like constellations. Whereas if I make a bar graph around that whiskey, you can tell how our whiskeys will and taste like. So it's part of our issue too as Canadian whiskey producers is education. We got to tell people that this is what we are and how diverse we can be.
Absolutely. And for those of you who want to sign up for the class that Dave mentioned, head over to camprunamok.org/Canada. For more info. We're going to have a lot more info coming soon. We have 2 more questions, y'all. I'll write the first. Do you have any single barrels in the portfolio?
You want me to take that question?
Mm-hmm.
Go for it, Doctor.
We got 1.6 million single barrels. How about that? Typically, no, we don't. Canadian whiskey, and that's the struggle I usually get all the time, is what can I have a single barrel program? Or I know it's very popular with bourbon, and it's understandably so because they make that mash bill up front. Really the only brand we have that comes from a single that is not really blended is Lot 40. Lot 40 is not blended, so that would be the one brand we could do that program with. But one of the things we've introduced in this last year is the Signature Series, and maybe Gina, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and I have a bottle on this side of my bar, if you can see it, of the Signature Series from last year. But we tested it out last year, and we just finished the blending sessions, Don and Dave and I, with some select retailers across the country. But you know, kind of our response, like Don was saying, to the single barrel ask, and that's not really representing what we do or, you know, Canadian whiskey as a category for the most part. So, you know, our response has been, well, let's create a custom blend that people get to, you know, look at Don's blending room there. You know, ideally they get to go to the distillery and work with all of those wonderful whiskeys to create their own blend with Dr. Don. Cool. You know, this year, of course, with COVID, we did it virtually and sent out kits. But, you know, we are customizing for certain customers. We're able to customize blends and really, you know, have something that represents what we do.
Yeah,
that's so
it's a growing program.
To add to it is we've done it the last 2 years in a row, and we've kind of showed it off on social media a bit, and where our rules and regulations in Canada are a little different than the US. Canadians have gotten very upset seeing that the Americans have been making their own blends. And I mean, just so you guys understand, when Gina said it's their own blend, it is theirs. Like, they come to the distillery and they create it with us. We bottle it and they sell it in their store. It's quite amazing. So last year there were 10 new expressions of JP Weissers in the US because the people make it. Like, really cool stuff.
Yeah, we actually had 2 groups that made 2 different blends because they were having so much fun and couldn't decide.
I get that. That just means double the time with Dr. Don. So I get
exactly.
Well, the last question is a very serious one. Which of your whiskeys tastes best with all dressed chips? The hard-hitting questions, guys.
That's going to be a cast strength to cut through that, because all dressed chips, that sticks around on your tongue for like 2 days. You're going to need a
I'm
strong
opposites. When it comes to food, I'm opposite. If it's an all dressed, that's very spicy. Probably not lot 40. I'd probably take the one to your right, Dave. Yeah, I think I'd take the Pike Creek if I was at all dressed chips.
Okay.
I mean, you could do the cast strength 22-year-old finished in port. Then you're going to have every flavor in the world in there.
Oh my goodness, that's crazy. But
Let's go for it.
I mean, it's it's an exciting category, and to talk about the cast strength and single barrel programs, that was the other strange ask we had. People, can you come out with cast strength whiskeys? And again, we got lot 40, which is simple for us to execute, but again, we're mostly blends. And we talked about the different methods of distillation. So typically somebody makes a cast strength whiskey, right? It's a single distillate, like bourbon, through a column still. They age it and don't add any water, where you go. Or if it's Scotch, they'll go through a double pot still or triple pot still, away we go. What happens when you have different things that are distilled differently? So you got a pot still whiskey here, I got a column still whiskey here, a double distilled. You put those ingredients together in a blend and you don't add any water. What do you call that? It's really not what the intent of what cast strength was when you did it, because typically they come from the same type of distillation. So the Weiser's 22-year that Dave just talked about, and we released a 23-year in Sweden and in Canada, we're going to be, we call it a cast strength blend. So you're taking all these different distillates of different strengths and putting it together, not adding water. So I don't know if that's an official term, at least it's a marketing type of term that we've used on our 22-year is a cast strength blend. And haven't really seen anybody else do that sort of thing when it comes to cast strength whiskeys.
Well, that just goes back to all that creativity and innovation that you get to, all that fun you get to have. Well, I cannot tell y'all how much I enjoyed this. It was so wonderful to get a behind the scenes look at what you do at Hiram Walker and to see the incredible work that all of you put in.
Yeah. And I would say you're more than welcome to, once we get out of COVID, come and visit us. We're right across from Detroit. We do have tours once we get up and running again, and it's at jpweiserstour.ca. And if anybody is really, really interested, that's the same website that we would use if you want to come and do a blending 101 with Dr. Don. And it's $100. We come in 2 to 3 hours. We come in, make our own blend with the setup you see here behind me. So very, very, very cool type of program.
Yeah. And I'll add in too, if anyone is out there, I know it's a social media world, if you ever have questions about anything, small or large, reach out to us on social media, especially myself. I don't want to put it on Gina and Dawn, but I know they're really great at getting back to people. I think, there's my handle. And then Dawn, yours is CDN Doc, isn't it? What's
CDN
your
Whiskey Doc?
CDN Whiskey Doc, there it is. And Gina Fossitt, like any questions or even follow Don and you get to follow his whiskey hijinks and learn all the geeky stuff about whiskey.
Well, I think we may have lost Lindsay in the woods somewhere, but oh, we found Brittany. There she is.
I'm here. Lindsay was being really nice and giving you the picturesque view by the lake instead of this lovely paneling that we have at Camp Run a Mug, but her phone went on a temperature timeout, so now you get me. Lucky, unlucky, you decide.
We're very lucky.
You don't have to tell me. It's good. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information and the beautiful videos. I'd like to thank Brylan, who's behind the scenes there, making everyone look wonderful and shooting all of this beautiful video for our stream today. Now that everybody has seen just the tip of the iceberg of what is coming for Canadian whiskey certification, the ABCs of Canada, make sure you go over to camprunamok.org/Canada. You can put your information in there and you will be the first to know. In fact, you will get a full 24-hour jump on being able to get your application in, and space is limited, friends. So make sure you put your info in there. Dr. Don, Gina, Dave, any parting words for the people?
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure, and we can't wait. Like you said, we can't wait to bring this certification to life with y'all.
And
you.
I can't wait to get back out. I am literally looking at Detroit right now. I'm a 10-minute cab ride from some of my favorite bars, and I cannot wait to be allowed south of the border. And yeah, come have a whiskey with all of you and see you sitting at your bars. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, we are so excited to get to spend 5 weeks at the beginning of the year with you, learning even more about Canadian whiskey. And to all of you watching, make sure you fill out the form. Make sure you smash that like and love button on your Camp Run Amok Facebook pages, your Portland Cocktail Week YouTube. I think that's the channel. We have Instagrams. Everyone here has an Instagram. Everyone on this stream currently. So follow these people because they're very smart and incredibly photogenic. So you're going to want to go over there and hit that follow button. Keep up with everything that is going on at Hiram Walker and with all of these lovely humans. I am going to go crack open that Texas Mickey of JP Weiser Deluxe and have myself a wonderful afternoon. To all of you, I'm wishing you a lot of Canadian whiskey and all dressed chips. Camp Run Amok out.